Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 9 game from the New York International. Now, if you followed the round 8 video, you know that I essentially drew a really long game against a pretty strong 2600 Grandmaster, and in the end, the draw was a fair result, considering that I was up, and then I was way down, and I managed to hold it in the end. My opponent in this one was a titled player that was a little bit lower rated than me by the name of Christopher Shen. I've actually been familiar with him for quite some time because he's actually played on the American tournament circuit for years, but he's actually very young. So I actually remember him as a small child, and now he's a teenager, and I think at the time of this game he was 16 years old, and has a FIDE rating of about 2300, so pretty reasonable player and a tough opponent with the black pieces. As you know, I haven't exactly been sharp this event, so every game has been a real challenge, and I wasn't really expecting any different in this one. So without further ado, let's get into it. So Christopher was white and opened with c4, and this wasn't a huge surprise to me actually, because I'd seen that he prefers these English type of fianchetto setups. So I went for e6, trying to keep it sort of classical, and after g3 it was quite clear that he's kind of happy to play a Catalan, which is characterized by the fianchetto of this bishop, and then typically playing c4 and sometimes d4. I went knight f6, and after bishop g2 went d5, and after knight f3, bishop e7, castles, white now played d4, and this is actually, you know, the beginning of like the mainline Catalan, and black essentially has a choice here. Black can choose to play a closed Catalan by not capturing on c4, notably by playing like knight bd7 and c6 and that sort of thing, or black can capture the pawn on c4, and typically white recovers that pawn, but black gets some counterplay in return. So typically if d takes c4, you see now this bishop is a monster on this diagonal, and the most popular move here for many years has been queen c2, and then after a6, the idea is after queen takes c4, you go b5, and you actually get your bishop onto this diagonal by playing b5 with tempo, and you're able to contest the white's light-squared bishop. Essentially, though, white has a very slight advantage because it's very tricky to actually play c5, and that's ultimately the goal in this structure with black, is if he plays c5, he doesn't have any problems. But as long as the c pawn is kind of backward, it is a potential weakness, and this is essentially the contour of the battle here is, will black be able to play c5 or not? I didn't want to test my opponent on this mainline Catalan because there are also a lot of forcing lines here. For instance, if d takes c4, white has the very forcing knight e5, and there have actually been many draws in this particular line because there's no way for white to defend, or excuse me, for black to defend the c4 pawn. And after knight takes c4, white would actually have a really nice central pawn majority, and the bishop that's, oops, my diagonal's wrong, the bishop really active on this diagonal. So essentially here the main line actually goes knight c6, and after bishop takes e6, b takes e6, knight takes e6, queen e8, knight takes e7, queen takes e7. There have actually been so many draws in this line because white typically recovers the c4 pawn with queen c2 or queen a4 and winds up having a better pawn structure because my pawns are split on the queen side. Also, in the past 5 years or so, after knight e5, actually after knight c6, excuse me, knight takes c6 has actually had a bit of a resurgence and has become very popular. The point is, after b takes c6, white doesn't actually capture the c6 pawn. That would be a poor move because after bishop takes c6, rook b8, the bishop on c6 would be kind of misplaced here, and the rook would already be primed to get counterplay on the b file. Instead, what a lot of white players are doing now is actually knight a3. And the idea is if white's actually able to recover one of these double pawns and maintain, you know, control in the center of the board, he actually has a really good position, and knight takes c4 is a serious threat. So here there's bishop takes a3, b takes a3, and yeah, just a super complicated line. I believe the move now is, I think bishop a6 has been seen a bunch, and then after there's actually queen d2 with the idea to bring this queen to a5, which is actually very, very complicated. The point is, though, that a lot of these lines with white are kind of forcing, so white gets to really kind of force black's hand in these variations. And so I've traditionally tended to prefer the closed Catalan structures and keep the tension on the d5 and c4 pawn. So I went knight bd7. Typically, the plan with knight bd7 is to go c6, b6, bishop b7, and just kind of develop a little bit more modestly, but hold off the bishop on this diagonal. So after knight bd7, white went knight c3. This move is actually fully justified because now if I take the c4 pawn, white can try to play like knight e5 and recover it, or excuse me, knight d2, and it's kind of tricky for me to defend it. So after d takes c4, knight d2 is an idea, trying to target the c4 pawn. Note that a move like b5 is impossible because the a8 rook is hanging. And knight b6 is a move, actually, that defends the c4 pawn, but typically you're not able to hold on to the c4 pawn when you release the tension. So maybe knight d2 isn't the best move here, but typically you're not able to keep the pawn after taking on c4. Anyways, after knight c3, I decided to go b6, and this is actually a critical mistake. Typically in these structures, the normal move is c6, and then you go b6 and bishop b7. And at the board, I kind of just had a brain fart, actually, because I really was going to play c6, but I kind of thought, well, why don't I just play b6 first? And the reason I was thinking about playing b6 first is because in many lines, when black's bishop actually winds up on b7, black would love to execute the c5 break. So what winds up happening a lot of the time, though, is that if, let's say, c6, queen c2, oops, not queen d2, excuse me, queen c2, b6, and then the problem is that white actually breaks with e4 before black actually gets in c5. So it actually turns out that black doesn't get in this break and then has to play these closed Catalan positions, which are, with the knight on e8, which are quite unpleasant. I've actually had a game in this variation earlier this year, and it was very, very difficult against Gauri Shankar. So I really was not about playing this particular version of the closed Catalan. So I thought, well, if I play b6, then I actually get to play c5 in one move instead of in two moves by playing c6 and c5. So now if queen c2, now c5 might be playable, or at the very least, my bishop could get to b7. And note that because the pawn isn't on c6, e4 is not actually a possibility anymore because I have three pieces on that square. So that was the rationale, but the issue with b6 and the reason this move in the database has been played less than 100 times is because the c6 square is actually vitally important to black's position, and it just weakens this one a little bit too much. Automatically, you could see a few things. Firstly, when you weaken b6, the squares adjacent are, or when you play b6, the squares adjacent are weak, so c6 and a6 are definitely more vulnerable than they were a move ago. And then in addition to that, now the bishop is now bearing down on this long diagonal, and you can see if the d pawn is actually off the board, this rook is seriously under fire. So those circumstances mean that it's really risky. And then to add insult to injury, the c6 square in particular can really be exploited by the white knight on f3. And you can imagine if a knight comes to c6 here, forking the queen and the bishop, white will get at least a bishop pair, but also the knight on c6 will be a really annoying wedge in the black camp. So basically, that's the reason this is not really played. And after b6, Christopher took full advantage by actually playing knight e5. Now, there are actually two attractive moves here. Knight e5 was one of them. The other move that's also playable is c takes d5. And the point is here, if I play knight takes d5, white could play e4 and actually just take the center and have a really fine position here. Or white can actually also play knight takes d5, e takes d5, bishop f4, and after rook c1, try to play against my hanging pawns here. This type of structure is known to be a little bit better for white because after I go c5, well, first of all, I probably would have to start with bishop b7 because if I go c5 right away, I can't actually recapture with the b pawn because d5 was hanging. But let's say rook c1, c5, d takes, b takes. These types of positions are known to be quite a bit better for white because these hanging pawns give black actually targets in his position. And after the knight moves typically to h4 or sometimes even to d2, the d5 pawn is more under fire because it's actually pinned because the bishop on b7 is hanging. So, and to avoid these hanging pawn structure, after d takes c5, you have to go knight takes c5. And then the issue with this is now you have an isolated pawn on d5, and white has the d4 square for his knight to firmly blockade your pawn and hop around to other weak squares. So basically c takes c5 is also an option trying to exploit that right away. But knight e5 is also a reasonable move, and you can see here that that knight c6 is a serious threat. Now, I went bishop b7 trying to cover the c6 square, but the issue here is now that I'm actually walking right into this pin. Note that now that the bishops are opposing each other and the knight has left the f3 square, now my bishop on b7 is quite vulnerable because it's actually unprotected. And this feature makes it extremely, extremely unpleasant for black. After bishop b7, white now went queen a4, and this is kind of the final kind of move that essentially determines why this position is significantly better for white. And the issue is, again, this knight c6 idea is super, super strong, just securing the two bishops, and very, very annoying to deal with. And so it just makes it very, very difficult to operate here. Now, I actually decided to play knight takes e5, understanding that this position was going to be considerably worse for me. And it actually turns out there's another way to play this position, and it's to actually play c6. But this is actually known to be much worse for black strategically. The point is that after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and queen takes c6, black does wind up recovering his pawn with the move rook c8. And then after the queen is forced to move, typically to b5, then rook takes c4 and e3. The material is equal, but the issue is that white has the bishop pair and a risk-free position. And I have weakened some light squares on the queen side that will be something that white can take advantage of. And essentially, this position is just extremely unpleasant and better for white. Also, if you're wondering, if the queen goes to b7, trying to just snag another pawn before rook takes c4, black has the move rook c7, which is quite important. And then after queen a6, I have knight b8. And so I actually do get to take the c4 pawn, no harm, no foul. But again, this type of position is not one that you kind of want to play. Because even here, after queen d1, white is a bit better based upon the two bishops. So basically, I had a choice between c6 and knight takes e5. I didn't really know about the c6 idea, so I went knight takes e5. And after d takes e5, we have another big problem because the pawn on d5 is now targeted 3 times. And I actually have 3 defenders now, but my knight on f6 is now being forced, or excuse me, I have 4 defenders because the pawn e6 is also a defender. But now my knight on f6 is being forced to move, and white can bring another attacker into the position with rook d1, so this pawn is very, very vulnerable. The other issue is that in many positions, the bishop is still tied down. Well, I should say the pawn on d5 is tied down because the bishop on b7 is unprotected. And so in a lot of positions, I can't resolve this tension, which I would actually love to do. And these factors just make it extremely unpleasant. So after d takes e5, I went knight e4, trying to trade some pieces. I figured that my best chance in this type of position was to essentially get to some type of endgame, perhaps a rook endgame, a pawn down, where I might be able to hold it based upon, my technique, and because I'm a bit higher rated. Because you can see here already there aren't many good squares. If I go to d7, well, then the pawn on d5 is actually hanging, right? C takes d5, E takes d5, knight takes d5, and this position is actually completely winning because in addition to being a pawn up, white also now has the threat of knight takes e7 and bishop takes b7, just winning a piece. And if I give up this bishop, this doesn't actually help me either because the rook on a8 is under fire, and the position is just collapsing. So this just doesn't work. I mean, if a move like rook b8, now e6 actually wins on the spot. And you could just see that if f takes e6, bishop takes e6, this is extremely problematic. So basically, that knight d7 is not a possibility. Knight e8 is just too ugly to even move, and this also doesn't help matters either because after rook d1, there's still this pressure. Actually, maybe c takes d5 first is better. It's just so I have to take with the e-pawn, and now after rook d1, this is just extremely, extremely bad. So really, knight e4 is the only playable move, and my hope was that I can trade a few minor pieces and maybe go queen e8 at the right moment and kind of hold on. After knight e4, white played c takes d5, and this is actually not the best move. It actually turns out that knight takes e4 is much stronger, and the reason for this is that after d takes e4 and rook d1, white is actually in firm control of the one open file right now, and white's bishops are actually better than black's bishops. In particular, the bishop on g2 is a bit better than the bishop on b7 because in many lines, this one is tied down to the e4 pawn. So actually, maybe it's not the bishops that are actually the huge deal, it's these double pawns. If you look in this position, white's double pawn on e5 is actually harder to attack than black's double pawn on e4 because the bishop is already lined up against it, whereas you can see my bishop on e7 is not close to targeting e5. And so that feature in the position just makes it much easier to play white. And after rook d1, I pretty much have to play queen e8. And after queen c2, we can already see that white is in prime position to potentially win this pawn on e4 and just get a really pleasant position because after the bishops come off the board, my light squares on the queen side will be like Swiss cheese. So yeah, this position is just better for white. Instead, after c takes e5, I do get some hope because now I can play knight takes c3, and this is a very important intermediate move, ruining white's pawn structure on the queen side. So even though white has this massive pawn majority on the king side now with these 5 pawns and these double pawns here, after knight takes c3, b takes e3, and e takes d5, I thought that I might have something on the queen side to keep, white busy at least, or thinking. Now, it actually turns out that e takes d5 actually was not the best move. Instead, the better try would have been bishop takes d5. And the point is here that after rook d1, I actually go queen c8. And I jettison the pawn on d5 this way. And the point is now my queen actually can come to e6 after I lose my pawn. So after bishop takes d5, that's really the only way to, play for something here because now, white's structure is ruined because of knight takes d3. After bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and rook takes d5, now queen e6 is an extremely important move that not only attacks the rook on d5, but also connects my rooks with tempo and really gives my position some coordination. Now, if queen d7 is played, trying to trade queens and retain an advantage in this position, I actually have the very, very unusual move bishop d6. And this is the move that would have been a tough find if I was looking at this line and I saw this and I was like, better for white. Because amazingly, after bishop d6, I recover my pawn. If queen c6, I just go bishop c5 and try to still trade the queens. And if queen d7 back, c6, I'm actually going to get reasonable counterplay because now f2 is also hanging as a consequence after queen takes e6 and f takes e6. So this type of position where, I recover material and, have my rooks connected means that, I'm actually I'm a quite decent place here. Note that, by the way, after queen e6, if white doesn't really do anything, black's threat is c6 to actually try to, get the e5 pawn. So, for instance, let's say c4 is played to renew the threat, protect the d5 rook. Now c6 and the rook has to move, and after the rook moves, I could take on e5 and also hit the rook on a1. So quite amazing resource, this take on d5 and queen c8, queen e6. Instead, I took with the e-pawn, and the other reason this is a problem is now my bishop on b7 is still passive and stuck losing the battle for this diagonal, because it's clear that the protected bishop is the more secure one on this diagonal. After e takes d5, white now played c4, and now Christopher's basically taking full advantage of the fact this bishop just stinks on b7, and I'm pretty much obliged to play c6 because c takes d5 was a threat. But now, after c takes d5, c takes e5, rook d1 was played, and you could just see here that d5 is still a weakness. The b7 bishop is vulnerable, and it just appears that white can pile up on this d-pawn. My fear was that, white would essentially go double rooks and then just win the d-pawn, and then after winning the d-pawn, go, rook d7, and essentially win the game by taking control of the 7th rank. And I saw this, and I was like, oh man, this just can't happen. So I was really trying to find ways to play actively and creatively and thinking about jettisoning the pawn in some way. And that's why I started with the move bishop c5. And my idea with bishop c5 was that I wanted my queen to have a good square on e7, where after I actually lose the d5 pawn, my rooks would be reasonably connected, and my queen would be near my king side, but also attack the pawn on e5. And so I thought, maybe, just maybe, if I'm able to play queen e7, keep this bishop on the long diagonal, I might have some drawing chances, because it might be difficult for him to mobilize his double pawns and his pawn majority. The other thing I liked about bishop c5 is also shuts down the c file for white for counterplay. So the only file that white can really take advantage of is the d file, but that is sufficient, and white is still much better here. After bishop c5, white actually played queen b3, and technically this is another mistake. Now, it looks extremely promising to target the d5 pawn again. Note that now there are 3 attackers and only 2 defenders, and I'm going to lose this pawn. But it's just not very precise, because the pawn on d5 is going to be lost, so it actually is better to continue to mobilize your forces instead of going in for that pawn right away. Instead, bishop b2 would just be much stronger. And the point is, you protect e5, you connect your rooks, and you entertain doubling. And so after bishop b2, if I go queen e8 now, here I'd have to try and grovel in this type of ending. But the point is that after e3, again, white does not have to rush to take this d5 pawn. It's pretty much going to be lost. And that's kind of the key detail. Again, if you took the d5 pawn right away, let's say if bishop takes d5, this position is actually not so bad, because after bishop takes, rook takes, I have the move f6, amazingly. And the point is that I'm threatening f takes e5, but I'm also trying to get counterplay on f2. And if you take e takes f6, I think I might have rook takes e2, which is a really, really amazing resource that gets me counterplay on the 2nd rank, as well as on the f-file. And so this type of position you don't really want to play. After f takes g7, I have rook takes f2, and note that after rook d8 check, which looks like it wins, I have rook f8 check, blocking a check with a check. So this type of thing would actually just be winning for black now. So definitely not something you want to do. If I actually get an f6, I'm going to at least recover my pawn. And, white's still better in a position like this, for sure. Controlling the one open file and having a better pawn structure. But I have a lot of counterplay here, and it's not losing. So, essentially, in all these lines, it's important not to rush. And that's kind of the key thing. Another move that would have worked is actually bishop a3, just trying to get rid of this bishop on c5 that's kind of annoying, bearing down f2. I pretty much need to take because it's very undesirable for me to play b takes c5 and get these hanging pawns, especially with my rook on b7 being vulnerable. In fact, after, if I played a nothing move, bishop takes c5, after, let's say, h6, now white has a, pretty attractive choice of actually taking on c5 and going rook b1 and targeting this bishop on b7 that doesn't actually have a square on this diagonal anymore. Or white can also just play rook c1 and just challenge the bishop on c5. So, and then again, if this bishop is lost, or, traded, essentially, white's still a lot better here, given the nature of this d5 pawn. So, essentially, you could see in all these lines, white's better off if he actually connects his rooks and, does not rush to win the pawn. After queen b3, though, this actually gave me an opportunity to go queen e7, and all of a sudden I'm actually getting reasonable counterplay here because I'm hitting e5, and I've also connected my rooks, and it's not as bad as it looks. For instance, if bishop takes d5, bishop takes, rook takes, and rook a d8, if bishop b2, rook takes d5, queen takes d5, and rook d8, I actually have some very good counterplay here on the d file. So, again, all is not lost in a position like this where my queen now has solidity on the e6 square. I have some, activity on the d file. My bishop is actually eyeing f2. I'm holding things together here. So, after queen e7, white actually didn't take the pawn and actually decide to play bishop b2 now, defending the e5 pawn. But now I actually went rook a d8, and the point still stands. If white tries to, white actually played e3, but if white tries to, take the pawn multiple times, I'll play rook d8 and queen e6 like before. So after e3, he's actually blunting my bishop. I thought this was a good move. And here it still seemed to me like the position is quite dangerous because I thought white has this clear and pressing danger type of threat of playing rook d2, rook a d1, and taking on d5. And if he manages to take on d5 and control the d file, it's completely lost. So because of that, I actually decided to play queen e6 and protect this pawn. And after queen e6, white really strangely played the move bishop d4. This move was extremely puzzling to me because, typically, they say, I understand that he wants to blockade the pawn on d4 here, but typically it's actually better not to always occupy the square that you want to control. And this is actually a prime example because now that he's actually occupying the square on d4, he actually gives me an opportunity to trade some pieces and relieve some of the congestion in my position. Instead, rook d2 would have been significantly better, and to be quite honest, I'm not so sure what I would have done here, because after rook d2, the clear threat is rook a d1, and losing this pawn seems like an inevitability. I don't really see a good way to continue to defend it, and I guess I'd play h6 here, and after rook a d1, just kind of give up the pawn. But very, very difficult position, and I'm not so sure I would, be pleased with this. Instead, though, after bishop d4, he is threatening some lines to play rook c1, and, obviously it does seem a bit dangerous because now my d-pawn is firmly blockaded, but it actually gives me this amazing resource and kind of counterintuitive to play bishop takes d4. And the funny thing about bishop takes d4 is that if white plays e takes d4, he actually did not do this. I just have bishop a6. And the point is now this bishop that was doing nothing much on this diagonal and constantly a source of agony because the bishop on g2 was always pinning the d-pawn and challenging it. Now it could come to c4 and, simultaneously defend the d5 pawn, block the c file from a white rook, and the lone pawn on the queen side, the a pawn. And that would actually give me really, really good chances. Note that if a move like queen a3 is played, and bishop c4 trying to go after my a7 pawn, this would actually be just a repetition because now the queen is kind of caught behind enemy lines, so to speak, and can't run away. And so this maneuver with getting the bishop to c4 would actually, hold my position together, and all of a sudden I wouldn't even be worse. Because of this, actually, after bishop d4, this gives me an opportunity to just equalize because of this bishop a6 maneuver, and I think this is just something he missed when he went for bishop d4. Because now, after rook takes d4, which he did wind up playing, he actually gave me the e5 pawn, and somehow, some way, I'm actually temporarily a pawn up in this position. Who would have thought, And, of course, he's going to have to, take on d5 to, actually keep the material level, but that type of endgame with even material and just rooks on the board is probably a draw. So I thought the worst was over. Now rook a d1 was played, and it was quite clear he is going to win the d5 pawn and, probably try to get some, get some counterplay on the 7th rank, maybe trying to invade on d7 eventually. So I still wanted to be a little bit alert because I wasn't totally out of the woods yet, and I decided to play h6, just giving my king an escape square for the impending action on the d file. It's important that your king's a little bit secure. This was actually not the best way to make an escape square, in my opinion. Believe it or not, g6 is a slightly better way of doing that. And the reason is, in many endgames, the ideal structure for your pawns on the king side is actually f7, g6, h5. With that pawn structure, it actually ensures that even if you have a 4 versus 3 rook endgame, it should be a draw with best play because you're putting yourself in a position where if he's trying to trade pawns, you won't actually create any weaknesses in your camp. Whereas by playing h6, I actually create a little bit of a weakness on g6 that could be exploited down the line with h4, h5 in certain endgames. And so, essentially, the better way is to go g6 and h5. Very important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that might, get you on the right track to understanding which way to create luft for your king is just by looking at the color of your opponent's bishop. And I can't believe I broke my own rule here, but essentially, white's bishop here is a light squared bishop. And so, given that that's the context, I should play g6 because I want to restrict that bishop on the light squares. This is normally the rule of thumb that I use, but I thought that in some lines, if his rook got to the 7th rank, I wouldn't want my king on g7. I'd want on h7 to be further away from a potential check on f7. But this was actually just poor judgment, and h6 is just a slight inaccuracy. It doesn't change the evaluation of the position, though, because after bishop takes d5, I can just trade everything and the position kind of fizzles out. I actually saw an opportunity here and played rook takes d5. And the reason I did this is because after rook takes d5 was played, I actually played the move queen e4. And this isn't a move that wins or anything, but I thought it was quite interesting that I could even do this because it just illustrated how sensitive these light squares are with the fianchettoed bishop off the board. And so I temporarily did not take the exchange because now the rook on d5 is frozen because I could deliver mate on g2 with my battery. So all of a sudden, white has to be a little bit careful, just a little bit precise to hold. And of course he was. Christopher played queen d3. Good move, just trying to trade the queens right now. I could keep this going and try to play queen f3 and keep this battery, and the rook is still frozen. But I thought this wouldn't be so sensible because now e4 can be played, and it's actually white that's winning because now my queen is under fire and the diagonal is blocked. And so if I play queen takes d3, now after rook 5 takes d3, white is just an exchange up. So after queen e4, I took on d5 right away. And after queen takes d5, I recognize that if I trade queens, he's just, can play rook d7 and kind of try to press that endgame because has control of the 7th rank. So if like queen takes d5, rook takes d5, rook c8, rook d7. I didn't really want to play this. And so, even though this position is equal, so I decided to play, I started to play queen c2, just not to trade queens and try to keep a little bit of life in the position. But now white played rook d2, challenging my queen, and I went queen c7 back. And now king g2 is played, and it's quite clear to me that the position is just equal. I mean, white's king is very snug. White has good control of the d-file. There isn't much going on here. After king g2, I actually went rook c8, and then white played e4, and I played rook e8 now, trying to challenge the e4 pawn. And this move actually came with a draw offer from me, because to me, I just figured that there's really no way that white can, there's no way that black can win this game, frankly. And I did see, based upon my king side being a little bit weak, that there was a way that white could continue to press. So white actually accepted the draw here, but white could try to play h4 here and then h5 and actually kind of, establish that wedge on my king side pawns that I was talking about because of this h6 move I made. And it would still be a draw with best play, but it'd be a little bit uncomfortable for me. And I just didn't want to, have to grovel here with no winning chances. So I figured this now is a decent time before, he really could entertain seriously pressing to offer the draw. And thankfully, he accepted. What can I say? It was not a good game, not a good opening at all, and extremely disappointing, frankly, to play someone like, 100 points lower than you and not really challenge them at all. But sometimes this happens, and frankly, this happened a lot in this tournament where I just was not really pressing in good ways and finding myself worse in a lot of positions and having to claw back. And consistency is something that I need to really work on, because I've been very, very inconsistent in a lot of these games, and it's not good. It's not what it's going to take to become a Grandmaster. You need to be consistent to get to 2,500. And just to kind of, prove to you that, consistency is kind of important and matters, I actually did not lose a game in this tournament, right? So I actually, through 9 rounds, I had, I think, 3 wins and 6 draws, I believe, or maybe 4 wins and 5 draws. Any case, I did not lose a game in this 9-round event. This is actually the first time in my career in a 9-round FIDE event I didn't lose. But the issue is I played down 8 times, and because of that, I actually lost a little bit of rating from this tournament. And that just goes to show that, when you draw people that are like 200, 300 points lower than you, that's almost like a loss in some ways, rating-wise, because you lose like 3 points or 4 points, and it actually really hurts you and sets you back. So the rating system punishes you if you don't do your job, and I got to get better at it. I almost think it almost sounds like Bill Belichick in my head. He's like, do your job, the coach of the New England Patriots. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and/or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.